It's a real honor to have you back for this occasion, the opening keynote of Professor William Darity Jr. Those who know him better call him Sandy. Currently, he's the Samuel Du Bois Cook Professor of Public Policy, African and African American Studies, and Economics at Duke University in North Carolina. He's also the director of the Samuel Du Bois Cook Center on Social Equity at the same university and a professor emeritus at the University of North Carolina. He has served as chair of the Department of African and American Studies and was the founding director of the Research Network on Racial and Ethnic Inequality at Duke. He's an economist, but would say intellectually a widely traveled economist with very, very interesting cross-cutting research. His research focuses on equality by race, class, and ethnicity, so there's an intersectional dimension in his research. Now, most economists would maybe say intersectionality what? Because it's not so much a term frequently used by economists. He has also worked on stratification economics. Some would say he's the founding father of that strand of economics, but it's building on other people's work as well. He has worked on schooling and the racial achievement gap, North-South theories of trade and development. So with those in an interest in the global South, this is also really interesting work on skin, shade, and labor market outcomes, and the economics of reparations, which has occupied him as of more lately. He's also been interested in the Industrial Revolution, the history of economics, and the social psychological effects of exposure to unemployment. So really a wide range of fields of interest, and stratification economics, an approach he coined and formulated more explicitly in the mid-2000s, and that later on had been taken up by many students and scholars in different types of fields. It really builds on a range of older strands of thinking. The field was influenced, for instance, by conflict theory in sociology, the economics of slavery or enslavement, critical race theory, just to name three influences, and Professor Darity really manages to build bridges between those. Interestingly, because I did some research on his older work, there are two papers I want to single out here because they really show where he actually comes from as an intellectual. One of his first papers published in 1975 that emerged actually from his graduate work was titled Economic Theory and Racial Economic Inequality. And the 1982 paper I personally worked with as well is called The Human Capital Approach to Black-White Earnings Inequality, Some Unsettled Questions. So in that paper, he really exposed the poverty of human capital theory in explaining differential returns in labor markets. So this was a really important piece and was published in the Journal of Human Sources, and I recommend everyone to have a look at it. Since then, a lot of time has passed. Professor Darity, often together with colleagues, has published a lot, also in leading journals, including the American Economic Review, which is the major journal in economics. But as I know him by his work, I think that's not the standard you like to be measured with, because we all know about the problem of gatekeeping in economics, not just economics, also in other disciplines. You should not let your career be defined, by some of the journals that are very well known for this sort of gatekeeping, but it is a major achievement, of course. And as I said more recently, stratification economics attracted a lot of interest. One of the American Economics Association journals, the Journal of Economic Literature, in 2022 actually dedicated a special issue to stratification economics, which is a win in my view. William also wrote a paper in that special issue I recommend called Position and Possession Stratification Economics and Intergroup Inequality. William today is here with his long-standing collaborator and partner Kirsten Mullen. Together, I think they have become the most prominent voices in the US on the economics of reparations for descendants of formerly enslaved people of African descent in the United States. And this work has been very ambitious. It has also not been without backlashes because, you know, if you engage in that type of work, it is very political. And they have really tried to put numbers to the question, what would the public, the government of the United States today owe the descendants of formerly enslaved people of African descent if you want to put this in monetary terms. Of course, it's larger than a monetary question, but it is something very much needed, and both of them have to be thanked for this approach and project. And Kirsten will also be on a panel with us tomorrow, so I think there is more chance to talk about how you both collaborate. William maybe is someone interested in numbers, mathematics, modeling, Kirsten as well, but she also has many other talents. So I think that would be a wonderful occasion that both of you are actually here with us today. And so with that, I want to thank both of you to come and grace our event, a long flight from Raleigh in North Carolina. And I'm happy to hand over to Sandy. He will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we have a small discussion here between the two of us, and then I'm opening up to the public. So welcome, Sandy, and look forward to your talk.
Thank you. So I'm rather old-fashioned, so I do not have a PowerPoint. Okay. So first, I'd like to offer profound thanks to Stephen Oma for his invitation to Kirsten and me to participate in what I view as a very, very important conference. Also would like to thank him for his generosity and kindness in facilitating our visit. Thanks also to Nasir Abbas for his patience and attentiveness in planning our trip to Bayreuth, which was a fairly complicated itinerary route. So, and I also would like to say thank you to Isaac Akalogo for his support, and congratulations to him as a newly minted PhD in economics. In absentia, I would like to thank Franklin Obeng Odum for making the introduction to Stephen, and thanks also to my partner Kirsten Mullen, who you will hear from tomorrow. She's currently working on her own book project with her mother's memoir, for the Texas Tech University Press series on Afro-Texans. Her mother is an Afro-Texan, so... and we both have a delayed project on many of the issues that I'd like to explore with you today, a project that involves my longtime collaborator, Sam Myers, Jr., at the University of Minnesota. Stephen has made an invaluable commitment, as so many of you here are making, to the further development of stratification economics as a subspecialty in economics. Growth in the subspecialty is manifest in the fact that we are on the verge of starting a new periodical, the Journal of Stratification Economics, hopefully launching with its first issue in 2026. And we are actively soliciting contributions and would love to feature the work of those of you who are assembled here today. In a message sent about a week and a half ago, Stephen posed a set of questions that Kirsten and I will attempt to answer during the course of our respective presentations. I would like to repeat the first of those questions verbatim, which, in fact, I think Stephen made reference to in his introduction. He wrote the following: generations of heterodox economics students have been influenced by your critical papers on human capital theory. And, generations of heterodox economics students have been influenced by your critical papers on human capital theory and discrimination in the late 1970s and early 1980s, where you outlined the poverty of human capital theory for explaining differential returns in U.S. labor markets. How has stratification economics developed out of this project? So this is not a statement made out of false modesty, but frankly, I had no idea that generations of heterodox economics students were paying any attention to my work. But I do love the phrase, the poverty of human capital theory, especially since a certain bearded German intellectual published a book in 1847 called The Poverty of Philosophy in response to Proudhon's philosophy of poverty. And the historian E.P. Thompson had a collection of essays that was titled The Poverty of Theory. The poverty of invariably means the author is engaged in the subversion of what follows. Stephen's observation about generations of heterodox students and his question about the place of the critique of human capital theory in the development of stratification economics led me to go back to the paper that he mentioned that was published in the Journal of Human Resources in 1982. I must say, I'm old, but the 1975 paper was not a product of my graduate work. I had not entered graduate school yet at that point. It was my undergraduate honors thesis. So I think in 1975, I was 22 years of age, so still a young man at that point. I'm quite ancient now. But I wanted to go back to that paper. I wish that I had thought to call it The Poverty of Human Capital Theory, a straightforward flip on the human capital theory of poverty, but I think if I had done so, it may never have been published. So the paper advanced simultaneously a general critique of the mobilization of human capital theory to explain the overall distribution of income, as well as a critique of the use of human capital theory to explain intergroup disparities in income. In reviewing my old paper, I rediscovered some key contradictions that I had highlighted that undermine the central propositions of human capital theory. And the central proposition of human capital theory is the notion that individuals receive wages or compensation for their labor equivalent to their personal productivity in performing the tasks for which they are getting paid. And I will discuss 4 of these contradictions today. The first contradiction is produced by the presence of discrimination in labor markets, which drives the wedge between individual pay and individual productivity. Under a discriminatory regime, equally productive individuals from different social identity groups receive different wages. Since productivities are identical but pay is not, members of at least one of the groups cannot be receiving compensation equivalent to their personal productivity. Since the first edition of Gary Becker's famous Economics of Discrimination was published in 1957, economists have argued fiercely that such a condition where different individuals with the same productivity receive different pay, economists have argued fiercely that such a condition cannot persist, and it must come to an end under the normal workings of competitive markets, thereby restoring the predicted human capital equilibrium. Now, one of the purposes of stratification economics has been to challenge this standard position that has been taken by economists, and to argue instead, consistent with the empirical evidence, that discrimination is something that can persist under competitive conditions. A second contradiction is the apparent inconsistency between individual productivities and the overall contour of wages. In the absence of an independent measure of productivity besides the wage rate itself, this relationship between equating wages with productivity produces a maddening circularity in the relationship between wages and work efficiency. But in the absence of an independent measure, it is hard to make the claim that the structure of wages corresponds directly to the distribution of effectiveness in task performance on the part of members of the workforce, particularly if work efficiency or productivity is measured primarily by educational attainment, which it usually is by most economists. There certainly is no monotonic relationship between education and productivity if we use, say, output per worker as an indicator of productivity. So in my 1982 paper, I even made mention of the sociologist Ivor Berg's phenomenal little book called Education and Jobs, The Great Training Robbery, where he identified a set of occupations where more highly educated individuals are less productive than their less well-educated, lower-credentialed coworkers. This insight long predated publicity about corporate CEO salaries being grossly higher than the ordinary line workers. In a paper that I wrote with one of my undergraduates, Miles Underwood, we reported that in 2017, the average CEO of a Standard & Poor 500 corporation received 280 to 300 times the compensation of the typical worker in the same organization. Now, absurdly, this would imply that the average S&P CEO is 280 to 300 times as productive as the ordinary worker in their firm. That seems to be a very thin reed on which to support human capital theory. Sturdier support might come from an assumption that what the CEOs are receiving is not really wages, but actually a form of profit sharing. A third contradiction arises when, in the self-investment version of human capital accumulation, we acknowledge that self-investment is not purely a matter of personal effort and preferences. Prior inherited resources create different foundations for different individuals to engage effectively in self-investment. And a critical resource is the wealth held by one's parents and grandparents. If those wealth positions differ by race or ethnicity, then wealth inequality helps drive earnings inequality, not solely as a consequence of individual choices. Constraints matter, potentially more than preferences. Wealth inequality will prove foundational in stratification economics. The final contradiction concerns human capital accumulation linked to on-the-job training. On-the-job training only is accessible if you can get the job. And if discrimination excludes you from getting a foot in the door, then whether or not one obtains on-the-job training is not merely a matter of personal motivation or effort. Moreover, even when you get a foot in the door, intra-firm discrimination may limit the type and quality of on-the-job training you receive. Again, the story of human capital acquisition runs much deeper than individual wherewithal. Economists long have asserted that variations in productivity explain wage inequality as a general principle. From the outset of my resistance to the human capital explanation for both general and intergroup inequality, I was skeptical about whether it applied anywhere across the globe. The abstract for my 1982 article includes the following passage. This paper advances a systematic critique of the human capital approach to black-white inequality. Inadequacies are identified in human capital theory as a general theory of inequality as well as a specific theory of racial inequality. The critique suggests that a serious analysis of the black-white earnings gap will require an entirely new approach to the study of racial income inequality. The last sentence was a cri de coeur, a cry for help from my fellow colleagues in the economics profession. Very few of them seem to have heard the cry, and continued to merrily forge ahead with models where they set wages equal to the marginal productivity of labor unquestioningly. I didn't anticipate at the time that I was issuing a charge to myself. In 1982, I thought I would be occupied primarily with north-south models of trade and growth. This was a line of research that I did pursue, but increasingly toward the end of trying to stumble toward a general theory of intergroup inequality, which could be posed as providing this entirely new approach to the study of racial income inequality. That new approach crystallized in stratification economics, a theoretical framework that I have long conceived as a general theory of intergroup inequality, not something that was specific to the U.S. experience. Admittedly, a significant portion of the first paper where I introduced the nomenclature of stratification economics largely used illustrations from the U.S. experience. In a lecture that I gave in Charleston, South Carolina, which was the basis for that paper, the audience was silent after I finished my talk. I believe that I had attacked virtually every standard argument they had made themselves about racial economic inequality. And I hope y'all won't be silent at the end of the talk today. Okay. The rest of the world did enter into the presentation, but indirectly, when I attempted to upend the golden narrative of upward mobility for newcomers to the United States, so pivotal for the nation of immigrants trope that is so popular in my home country. Subsequently, in my own work and the work of many others, the principles of stratification economics have been applied to intergroup inequality in multiple countries, locations, and situations. To list more than a few, I would include the circumstances of Afro-Brazilians. I would include the conditions of Dalits, tribals, and Muslims in India, caste inequality in general in India, blacks and Asians in the UK, the Turkish ancestry population in Germany, North Africans in France, indigenous people everywhere who have been subjected to land appropriation, frequently under the mantle of the doctrine of terra nullius, which means that there was nobody there when the settlers arrived. Okay. Palestinians in the Middle East, the Rohingya in Myanmar, blacks in southern Africa, particularly in South Africa itself, ethnic division and genocidal violence in the former Yugoslavia, ethnic division and genocidal violence in Rwanda and Burundi, descendants of persons who were enslaved domestically in West Africa, in particular in Nigeria, the Roma in Romania and elsewhere in Europe, ethnic stratification and job stratification in Kenya's labor market, colorism as a compounding line of distinction globally, immigrant acceptance and rejection across the globe. And although that's a fairly lengthy list, it's probably not the complete list. My premise is that stratification economics provides a general theory of intergroup inequality. Methodologically, stratification economics calls for a reorientation of the way in which we study inequalities between racial, ethnic, gender, or religiously divided social identity groups. It has not resulted yet in the development of new statistical techniques nor new approaches to mathematical modeling, although it has made good use of existing options in the more formal versions of the work that has been done in this genre. So I would include the applications of dynamic game theory, the use of systems of differential equations to try to determine the long-run outcomes of cumulative processes, the use of advanced regression analysis, utility theory, as I will point out in a moment from basic economics, is a natural here, although one of the proponents of stratification economics, John Davis, actually hates this idea because he doesn't like the use of utility theory. There's also been some modification of the tile index of inequality that has been generated as a consequence of the work that's been done in stratification economics. But the reorientation that I'm talking about is not directed primarily at the creation of new techniques of analysis. Primarily, it asks us to alter the questions that we ask and alter the priors that inform our investigations. Most important, it challenges us to change the types of research deemed important and valued. Key to this reorientation is a specific critical prior. When we observe inequalities between social identity groups, under the orbit of stratification economics, we no longer will seek even a partial explanation in the inferiority or dysfunctionality of the group in the subordinate position, nor will we seek the explanation in the superiority or higher functioning of the group in the dominant position. Instead, the disparities must be understood as a product of historical and contemporary power differentials between the groups, with the underpinning of the omnipresent threat of violence from the dominant group, and the threat is often realized. Thus, stratification economics erases scientific attention being given to arguments about subordinate groups being in that position because of their own defects and deficiencies, or simply their perverse preferences. The reorientation represents a move beyond happiness research's recognition that in addition to being concerned about their absolute condition, individuals are concerned about their relative position vis-a-vis reference peers. In stratification economics, individuals also care about the absolute and relative position of the social groups with which they identify. Let me repeat that. Individuals care about the absolute and relative position of the social groups with which they identify. If we were to use the standard utility function apparatus, despite John Davis's reservations, from the standpoint of stratification economics, an individual gets greater satisfaction if they perceive an improvement in their absolute condition as well as their relative position among members of the social identity group with whom they self-classify. But also they gain in satisfaction if there are absolute gains for their social identity group collectively and an improvement in the relative position of their social identity group collectively. A further extension relevant to the phenomenon of passing is inclusion as an argument in the utility function, one's potential relative position if you were situated in the other group, that is the comparison group. Now, this general form of the utility function generates the possibility, depending on the weights that an individual gives to each of the arguments in the function, that a person's loss in absolute circumstances could be more than offset by a gain in their relative position, either from the standpoint of their individual comparison with racial and ethnic peers, but also a gain in the relative position of their social identity group. In the U.S. context, frequent references are made to the idea that the white poor vote against their own economic self-interest by embracing policies that support a regime of anti-black racism, while if they didn't support that regime, they could potentially be better off. Similar claims have been made about the choices of working class members of dominant social groups in other parts of the world who presumably would be better off if they sided with the marginalized communities in their society for mutual economic gain. This is the type of argument that falls under the genre of a class of statements that I would describe as racism hurts everybody, except perhaps a wealthy elite few. Or, as a special case, slavery allegedly hurt everyone except the wealthy planters. To the extent that pain is subjective and individuals care with sufficient strength about the relative status and group of their group position, their well-being could improve, although they may lose with respect to their absolute condition. However, I submit that losses in absolute condition typically are overrated, and racism materially benefits all whites, and in-group chauvinism materially benefits all members of a dominant group. Foregone class solidarity across racial or ethnic lines does not generally damage those who are even at the bottom of the dominant group's social ladder. I'm not going to pursue this further here, but as an example of the scope of the argument that I'm trying to make, please look at the review, my book review of Heather McGee's The Sum of Us. Now, perception is critical. Members of a dominant group may believe their relative position is threatened or is under erosion, although there's no evidence to actually support this belief. Herbert Bloomer, in his marvelous 1958 essay, Race Prejudice as a Sense of Group Position, said the following. He wrote that there were 4 feelings held by members of the dominant group associated with race prejudice. The first is a feeling of superiority. The second is a feeling that the subordinate race is intrinsically different and alien. Third, a feeling of proprietary claim in certain areas of privilege and advantage. And fourth, a fear and suspicion the subordinate race harbors designs on the prerogatives of the dominant race. It's this fourth feeling that embodies the threat factor. Stratification economics proposes that even if members of the dominant group are in error about the so-called progress of the subordinate group, the fear of loss of status results in their support of policies that reinforce their position as the dominant group. The motivation for the policies adopted may be wrong-headed, but the policies still are consistent with the objectives of dominance. The scope of false beliefs can be staggering. Michael Krauss and Jennifer Richeson's research program at Yale in social psychology demonstrates this quite clearly. They surveyed Americans in their project and demonstrated that collectively there is a gross underestimation of the size of the racial wealth gap. Survey respondents underestimated the U.S. racial wealth gap in the past, 1963, the year immediately before the passage of the Civil Rights Act, underestimated the U.S. racial gap by 40 percentage points, and in the present, 2016, in their study, by 80 percentage points. Although the black-white wealth gap has largely remained unchanged or widened slightly on the basis of a standard ratio measure over the course of the past half-century. Obama's election as president, which was mentioned a bit earlier, was widely described as signaling the end to the American race problem, although during his presidency there was no evidence of a reduction in the degree of racial economic inequality. Policy consequences of these kinds of false beliefs can be captured in, for example, the attack on an anti-discrimination measure like affirmative action. Opponents have characterized affirmative action as reverse discrimination and have argued it is no longer necessary since discrimination is no longer significantly present. Okay. They are arguing, of course, that selection for preferred positions is entirely made on the basis of merit. With respect to detection of discrimination, there are two major approaches that have been used by economists. One is a statistical approach, and the second is a series of field experiments in which matched pairs of testers approach employers. We try to determine which racial group is more likely to be chosen by the employer, despite the fact all of the applicants are given faux resumes that are equivalent, or in some instances, the resumes of the testers from the group that is presumably most likely to be exposed to discrimination are actually slightly superior to the resumes that are given to the others. Okay. Well, these tests consistently demonstrate discriminatory behavior on the part of employers. But nevertheless, despite this smoking gun, those persons convinced that discrimination cannot persist are not even persuaded by this research. In statistical research, the unexplained portion of earnings, health, or economic or other economic disparity regressions, the unexplained portion is interpreted as evidence of discrimination by some researchers. There is a standard counter to that interpretation, which is based upon the invocation of unobserved heterogeneity. Okay. Well, that simply means that what's not explained could be explained if we had more precision about measuring other attributes that individuals have that could be linked to their productivity. But here, the racism is palpable because this counter is advanced on the assumption that the unobservables always favor the group that is in the position of ostensibly benefiting from discrimination, or what we could think of as the dominant social group. Social psychologists increasingly give us the ability to measure these unobservables. They come up with instruments that can capture things like motivation and effort. And in the U.S. context, motivation and effort actually favors a subordinate group like Black Americans. And so when you incorporate those measures into your regression analysis where you're trying to detect discrimination, you actually increase the likelihood of perceiving discrimination rather than reducing it. So my key point is that it's not legitimate to assume that the unobservables always favor the dominant social group. I'd like to turn next to the question of social identities, particularly multiple identities, or what we now are accustomed to referring to as the phenomenon of intersectionality. I have a former graduate student, she's now completed her degree, named Imari Smith, who introduced a better term, I think, for describing this. She refers to concurrent identities. I really like that. It's kind of neat. The question is whether or not an individual possessing more than one identity has a combination of penalized and advantaged identities. And if they do have such a combination, to what extent are these discriminated identities dominant over their advantaged identities or vice versa? Or if an individual has a panoply of discriminated identities, so how severe is the penalty that they incur? Some researchers argue that intersectional theory posits that among persons with multiple identities, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, religion, disability, and so on, that the impact of any one of their identities on their life outcomes or wage are qualitatively different from the impact of a single identity on an outcome, and suggests that they are quantitatively different from the mere sum of the effects of the separate identities. So there's some work that I did in conjunction with Mark Paul and Kaiying Zhao, in which we attempted to come up with a procedure based upon some prior work by Marlene Kim for trying to determine whether or not holding multiple identities are additive in effect, subtractive in effect, or multiplicative. And the way in which we did this was by doing pairwise comparisons between blacks and whites in the United States on the basis of gender. So I'm not at all convinced that this really does what we wanted to do, but the idea was to try to identify the pure gender effect by comparing the degree of discrimination that was faced by black men and black women, and by white men and white women, and then to try to identify the pure race effect by comparing let me get this right, comparing all well, it's a flip on the previous exercise. So we compare women again. We compare black women against white women, and we compare black men against white men. So in this case, we're controlling for gender and looking at what the race effect is, and then sorting all that out. And one of the conclusions that we reach is that for black women in particular, the possession of two penalized identities actually has a multiplicatively adverse effect. Now, this raised a bit of a furor among folks who said, well, clearly black men don't have a particularly advantaged position in the United States, even though they are men. And actually, that complaint is valid. The research that we did does not include men who are incarcerated. And if you were to include them, it would alter the conclusions of this research a bit. not about the impact on black women, but about the magnitude of the impact of discrimination on black men. Then the other thing I'd like to talk about is the importance in stratification economics of the idea of the endogeneity of identity. Okay. That people, to some degree, select their identities. Now, they select these identities under constrained conditions. One of the constraints might be their phenotypical appearance. But we know in U.S. data that there are large numbers of Latinos who self-identify as white racially, even though they phenotypically are extremely dark complexion. So it's a very interesting question. There's some work that I did with Tanya Golash-Boza that was published in Ethnic and Racial Studies in 2008, where we looked at the factors that influence Latinos' choice of race category, where we treated racial identity as the dependent variable in the analysis rather than a variable on the right-hand side. The question is always, which among multiple identities are salient under particular circumstances? So if we think about the fact that white women in the United States, both in 2016 and 2020, voted, among those who voted, the majority of them voted for Donald Trump, and overt misogynists, one might argue that their racial identity took dominance or precedence in that context over their gender identity. This is stratification economics points us in the direction of thinking about these kinds of issues. One last point I'll make about the self-determination of identity. There is a big puzzle that I attempted to try to begin to address in my Journal of Economic Literature paper, which is, why does anybody self-identify with the subordinate group? Okay, I'll leave that question right there for you. Okay. Final thing I'd like to talk about is measuring racism, and that's a subject that came up, pretty intently in the discussion that the first panel had. So, if we think about racism as something that is interpersonal, then it can be measured by trying to capture people's attitudes and beliefs with some care, because people self-censor in environments in which they think it's not comely to express certain attitudes. So you have to really design your survey instrument in such a way that you get really candid approaches, or you do what Eduardo Bonilla Silva did. You have in-depth interviews with the individuals that are conducted by a same race interviewer. And that's a way of getting a handle on what people's core beliefs are about race. But when we start thinking about racism that is linked to policy, we're talking about something that we now refer to as systemic or structural racism. And that, to me, is far more important than attitudinal beliefs per se. But how do we capture that? Well, that's a complicated task. And the panel earlier was talking about the whole question of latency, which is just a fancy way of saying we're trying to find a proxy for this thing that is hard to measure. I think Kirsten Mullen and I would propose that actually there's a very straightforward measure of structural racism. And that measure, particularly in the U.S. context, maybe it would be different in a different location, is the racial wealth gap. The racial wealth gap is the most comprehensive measure of the cumulative intergenerational effects of white supremacy. And we know that it has tremendous causal probity. So, for example, there's a study that was completed that demonstrates that if the racial wealth gap had been eliminated before the pandemic, the transmission rates of COVID-19 would have been reduced anywhere from 40 to 60%, and this would have included a reduction in the transmission rates among white Americans as well as Black Americans. There's also another study that was led by Catherine Himmelstein that says that if the racial wealth gap was eliminated, the longevity differential between blacks and whites would be virtually eliminated as well. So we'd like to propose that that's a potential way to think about measuring structural racism. Now, you may have noted a major silence in my presentation. I've never mentioned the term capitalism nor racial capitalism. And this is because I don't view intergroup disparities as specific to capitalism, nor racism as specific to capitalism. Hierarchical modes of production of any type produce incentives for a group to seek to capture the preferred positions along the social pattern of stratification. What may be specific to capitalism is anti-black racism as a consequence of the critical role that the transatlantic slave trade and slavery in the Americas played in the rise of the industrial world. But the theoretical apparatus of stratification economics is not specific to the United States, it is not specific to the Americas, and it is not specific to the capitalist mode of production. We already have indications that racism does not disappear with the transition to a new mode of production. We have evidence of the presence of ongoing racism in putatively socialist societies. So as a consequence, it is the question of hierarchy that lies at the heart of the existence of racism. It's not an aberration. It's normal, unfortunately. So that as we move to any type of new form of a society, as long as hierarchy is in place, then we have the high likelihood that there will be forms of intergroup disparity produced by processes of racism. And the last thing I'll leave you with is, I'm not sure how artificial intelligence is going to play out into the analysis of the evolution of human societies and the presence of racism. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you.
Merci bien.
Yeah, thank you, William, for this wonderful presentation. Totally unrelated to the content, I think your presentation was a proof you don't need PowerPoint to entertain. Even if it's a serious topic, I think you really managed to enroll the audience.
Well, to be frank, I didn't actually have time to prepare a PowerPoint.
But I just want to pose two questions before we open up. So be mindful that many people here are not economists. So it may be not immediately clear what you mean by a utility function and what role it plays in your reasoning. Maybe you could briefly elaborate on that and then also bring in your colleague. I'm not sure which one was it, but you have a colleague who doesn't like the term utility function. Maybe you can also build a bridge to that type of criticism you receive from him.
Yeah, I think his resistance is because he views the use of this thing that I'm referring to as a utility function as excessively mechanical, whereas I view it as completely fluid and flexible. But what we mean by utility functions are a notion of a relationship between what people possess or what they perceive as their possessions and how satisfied they are in life. And the original way in which economists thought about this is pretty simple-minded. Individuals have more satisfaction if they have more goods. Okay, and the pivot that occurred with the research on human happiness was the finding that it was not primarily the amount of goods that people had that dictated whether or not they felt better, but it was the amount of goods in comparison with others who they viewed as their reference group. What I was referring to as relative position. And then the further pivot with stratification economics is to say that human satisfaction is driven in addition by your perception of the position of the social group with which you identify, not exclusively your personal possessions or your personal possessions in comparison with others in your peer group or your reference group, but also the status position of the social identity group with which you connect, your affinity group, if you will. And so that's what I was trying to say, is you could modify the old-fashioned, multiple goods utility function to include these relative effects, and then examine what the implications are.
Thank you, Sandy. A second question on social context or political context. So in the beginning, I talked about that we are in a way still at the beginning in Germany of institutionalizing racism research, and there's a political and social context in which we operate. So I was wondering, since the election of Donald Trump, and I know this for climate science, where there were clear plans of the Trump administration to sabotage, in a way, climate, research, and have similar things been happening already under his tenure when it comes to, let's say, inequality research, especially research on racialized inequalities? Or is it still something that may yet happen once, the power configuration changes again?
So first of all, I think in a way you have an advantage if this body of research is in its comparative infancy here, because you don't necessarily have to carry the baggage of the work that has been done before. I've spent many, many years in my career of having to try to challenge or attack the structure that I guess Keynes might have referred to as the Citadel's point of view. And so if you don't have to do that here, that's really quite beneficial, because then you can forge on with the serious research program. But in terms of the question of the political climate around this type of research in the United States, one of the things that Kirsten and I discovered as we were doing our work on reparations is that there has been a sea change in American attitudes towards reparations, particularly among white Americans. In the year 2000, a survey that was conducted by a couple of researchers at the University of Chicago found that 4% of white Americans endorsed monetary payments as reparations for Black Americans. Okay. That's FOUR. But a survey that was conducted by some researchers at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst in early 2023 found that figure was closer to 30%. And I think that that's a reflection of a change in attitudes that are a consequence of a change in information and understanding that some people have about the history of the United States. And so I think it's the historical record that is the really contested terrain. And that is why after Trump's presidency, there has been this assault on so-called critical race theory and deep attention drawn to the content of what is being taught in our public schools and an attempt to sanitize the record of what is being taught in our public schools. That sanitization took place, prior to the 1960s, and then there was a reversal. And I think that there are folks who are trying to restore the kind of social studies and history training that students get that will resemble more of what was taught prior to the 1960s. And in some instances, just get rid of social studies instruction altogether. So that's where I think more of the assault has been launched thus far than on the research that has been conducted by academics.
Thank you, Sandy. I think we're opening up here. I have a second mic. I'm not sure, Nasir, whether you're flexible or Isaac could do it. It's switched on. We take a few questions, maybe 3, and then we bounce back to Sandy and then have another round.
Thanks. Thank you very much for a wonderful talk. I just wanted to follow up directly on one of Stefan's questions, the one you just addressed, because I also was tempted to pose it to the panel earlier. I think you're right that the realm of history and historiography is probably the place where this fight is happening at its hottest. But remember that in his first administration, Donald Trump systematically tried to dismantle or underfund the U.S. Census, which is actually a major source of information on inequality of all different kinds. And from what I've read, he's planning, if he gets back in again, heaven forbid, to continue that line of attacking sort of the statistical infrastructure. And that's an international phenomenon too. I think Stephen Harper in Canada around 2010, somewhere around there, also discontinued the long form of the Canadian census. And I think there's a growing awareness among many conservative activists that the less we can know about inequalities, the better, so to speak.
And you're making this point in the context of the European Union, where most of the countries refuse to collect data on race. So you have an ostrich in the sand phenomenon, right? And so, yes, I mean, I think that's true. And even more, perhaps, well, I don't know if it's more disturbing, but the Project 2025 document sets up an intentional apparatus to dismantle the independence of the civil service altogether. And so data collection is part of that independent civil service activity.
Great question. Next, please. Yeah, in the back.
So first of all, thank you very much. And right now my mind's like really working on actually the implications of your theory. I mean, granted that I understood it in the 40-minute talk which you gave, which by the way was really interesting. What scares me, and I might be drawing a very wrong conclusion or an invalid conclusion, but it's basically the one argument that you brought forward that a dominant, or let's call it a privileged group, will consciously or unconsciously always strive to maintain that position. So what I'm in turn asking myself is that, does that mean also that, let's say, the more social identities we have within a society, does that add to, let's say, that fight between groups? I hope I'm expressing myself clearly, because this in turn would, for me, have the scary implication that actually, let's say, modern day migrational policies trying to have a very liberal attitude towards social migration between countries, within countries, would actually, let's say, work like oil, like basically add oil to that fire of like social fight between social identities. And I'd be very interested in whether you would say that's right, or am I drawing a very, very like wrong conclusion here? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that if we look at the recent history of migration and the reaction of the resident population, then I think your point's well taken. Actually, you're more pessimistic or disturbing point of view, and I mean that's precisely why we have these anti-immigration movements in so many countries. Now, there are different categories of immigrants. So if we think about the Asian immigrants to the United States who have migrated to California and work in the high technology sector, there's not the same degree of ire that's directed toward them as there are to immigrants from other parts of the world who are entering into lower status occupations. So that's something that we need to sort through. But yeah, I mean, if you're expanding the degree of differentiation in a society, then you do have the possibility of expanding the degree of interethnic antagonism. It's not always the case. I mean, in most instances where we have these antagonisms, there's really two social groups, and they might well have been in that society for a long, long time. But you know, the issue that you're raising is actually a possibility.
So just maybe to re-clarify, I think there's a kind of pessimism that shines through the theory. And of course, the recipient of the message then also sees the pessimism. And then maybe people coming more from a historical school, they would argue, aren't you maybe too pessimistic or creating a too primordial take on the utility function, where history and social contexts move to the background, and then it appears that people always have been like this, thinking about hierarchies. Systems might change, but there's a primordial element there, transhistorical, that always produces intergroup conflict and intergroup struggles, basically.
So I'm not a believer in inevitability nor teleology, but I'd be hard pressed to find a situation in which these types of intergroup antagonisms have not taken place.
Thank you. Okay, we take more.
I have more. So thank you for this very inspiring talk. I have so many questions, and I was struggling to select two. So one of the things that struck me at the end of your talk was when you were saying, you know, numbers of white respondents, that the share of white respondents that support reparations, that's a huge number. It's a huge, change in 20 years.
Yeah.
How does that fit with your theory of, intergroup relations? That's my first question. The second question is, and kind of, I was wondering, and it came up, it popped up suddenly when you said, in Europe, you don't measure, you don't observe the categories of race, right? And we are struggling and discussing about these things, how to do that without reifying, right? And that brought me to ask you, like, how do we know which groups are actually groups? Because part of the problem of racism is the fictional character of these groups, and that the productive or constructive.
It's fictional biogenetically.
Yeah, no, I mean also,
but it's not fictional socially.
Yeah, but what I'm trying to say is that there must
clearly is not fictional socially.
Yeah, but that includes, but that implies that there must be a variation over time, and there must be also categorical changes. We know that from the U.S. Census that these categories multiply, they change. The criteria for belonging to a given group change. All of these things make it, I think, difficult. I mean, maybe you can explain that to me here. Make it difficult to understand for me how, under the circumstances of the variance, or there's an unclarity in the dimension of where do I belong to, or how do I, how's the mechanism of defining that?
It's the only way you can do it is ultimately through, for census purposes, is through self-classification. And the way in which people may self-classify will change over time. In fact, the same individual could respond to the census in a different way in different years. So, but I don't know what else you can do in terms of gathering that kind of information. So there are some people who always will say, when they're referring to race differences in their data, that they're talking about self-reported race. But if you go back prior to 1960, individuals' racial status was coded by the census taker, not by the respondent themselves, and they bounce around. Kirsten's doing a lot of work on Queen Mother Audley Moore, who was a reparations activist in the mid 20th century, and her family has this bizarre kind of pattern of racial identification, but it's not their own classification. It's whatever the census taker decided to label them as. So I think it's much more fruitful to have a situation in which people self-classify, and then we have to adjust to the changing norms that people are using over time. But I think if you avoid doing that, you avoid having any information about the disparities that are linked at least to self-reported race. I mean, you raise a really good question, but I think it's worse to not collect the data than it is to try to collect it and have a real sense of what kinds of disparities exist in your society. Now, your first question was about the change in attitude among white Americans towards reparations, and isn't that inconsistent with the model that I have tried to put forward? And I've been concerned about this issue as to whether or not members of the dominant group will ever defect. And there's a section of my paper, Positions and Possessions, that the Journal of Economic Literature 2022 paper, where I'm trying to explore that. Why would members of a dominant group ever subscribe to policies that might actually benefit the subordinate group? And I'm not sure I have adequate answers in the paper, but I would love to see other people look at that discussion and improve it.
Thank you. More questions? We have about 15 minutes left.
Just the classic line.
Just a sec.
Kirsten.
So I was just saying, anecdotally, you could look at the police reports on race. The police always know who's black.
Yeah.
Thank you, Kirsten. We have a panel tomorrow on evidence, I think, where these questions, hopefully, I don't know, will pop up again. And of course, you heard the Vice President speaking about the need for institutional data. It requires resources to fund that type of research. She said you are the resources actually it's money that are resources, and then you are creative, skilled people who can use that money. But it is tricky even at a university type of level to come up with a study with a proper type of classifications. And this, I'm really looking forward to tomorrow, where hopefully we can discuss more about that in an institutional context. But now to the person in the back. Yeah.
Just thank you very much for your presentation. I want to go back to the methodological approach to your theory, and to something in particular regarding what you spoke about with regressions and attributing the unknown part of what can be explained by regression to discrimination. When I was still going to graduate school, the state-of-the-art to measure, for instance, a gender pay gap was something maybe you're familiar with, probably, is the Oaxaca binder decompositions.
Yeah.
That do exactly that. The unknown part of sort of the regression equation becomes what you attribute to a gender pay gap. And the gender pay gap, and if we could also attribute it to perhaps a racial pay gap, is a huge topic, and it's both sides of the Atlantic very controversial because people pose structural explanations for the perceived or the observed differences in wage attainment of the genders, and for the U.S. also between races. In that sense, I'm just not entirely sure how else. I'm just not questioning your theory. It's more of a, let's say if I want to put it into practice, how would I go about measuring a pay gap between races without a decomposition of that nature?
Without what?
The decomposition, like the Oaxaca binder decomposition, or what methodology?
Well,
yeah.
The work that I was referring to, when we were looking at multiple identities or concurrent identities, was essentially using a blinder Oaxaca decomposition, and the way in which it's customarily been interpreted is what's left outside of the explained portion of the regression is frequently treated by folks who are looking for discrimination as evidence of discrimination. And then, of course, there's the response that you've omitted something because it wasn't measured or observable, and that difference is explaining some significant part of the unexplained portion. I'm not sure if you're making the point that the observables are also potentially generated by discriminatory processes. And the answer to that is, of course, yes. But the gambit that economists have customarily used, as you know, is to make a distinction between pre-market and market factors. And so they're arguing that the processes that generated the productivity-linked characteristics that we can actually measure are things that occur before people enter into the sphere of being selected for a job. And so the claim is that if you control for those attributes, you are capturing in a more precise way the behavior of individuals who are making hiring decisions, and taking as given whatever the processes are that generated these characteristics. Of course, this becomes very important if you focus on education and you talk about a situation in which you have segregated schooling, and one of the communities that's in the sphere of segregated schools is getting an inferior quality of education. Then, the dice are loaded when those individuals enter the labor market. The difficulty is, though, historically in the U.S. situation in particular, if you were to identify people who had comparable education with whites, they're still getting bumped down. But I don't know if that gets at what you're talking about at all.
Yeah, to a certain extent it does. And I think I might have also just the approach to how we understand your theory and then just put it into practice. I think you're basically saying that we can use current methodological approaches, but just interpret it a different way. And that's what you're getting at.
And also we have to be careful about using them always. Like I said, for me, the most powerful mechanism for detecting discrimination is the field experiment approach. The statistical approach is always open to the charge that there's something that hasn't been measured. And I think it's harder to make that claim with field experiments, whether it's a correspondence test or it's a trained actor test.
Yeah. Thank you. Great. We can take 2 questions together before we have to close. Who else?
Okay. Can I ask?
Yes. Economist to economist. That's good. So thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. So towards the end, you make the point that you do not raise the question of capitalism because you think that the mode of production doesn't. Maybe I'm wrong. I just wanted you to highlight again. You do not think that there's any difference in a capitalist system and a socialist system.
No. I wasn't saying there isn't any difference. Yes. I'm saying that the possibility of intergroup disparity exists in both types of societies, and I'm referring to what Rudolf Varro would have called actually existing socialism, not necessarily an ideal form of socialism that we have never realized, but in societies that purport to be socialistic. Now, it is interesting to note, though, that the Soviet Union successfully managed to suppress ethnic antagonisms. And it was only in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union that you had situations like the genocidal violence in the former Yugoslavia. So, that's an interesting question. But the suppression was coerced. So it's very complicated. Yeah, but all I'm trying to say is that intergroup disparity is not specific to capitalism. Yeah.
Thank you. More? Yes, there's a person there.
Thank you for the nice talk. I have just a short question regarding the data which you mentioned, maybe the artificial intelligence, how it will affect. So basically, so while collecting the data for the racism research, do you think that the biasness will affect the findings and the reliability of the results?
Bias about what?
Biasness about collecting the data. So if the person who is doing the study is from the priority group or is it the minority group?
Oh, I don't think it's inevitable that the status of the individual affects the quality of the data collection. I think it's contingent on what the methods are that the individual is using for collecting data. And I would say that the majority of data that's collected in the United States is not collected by members of a so-called minority group. So no, I don't think that there's an inevitability about the quality of data collection that's associated with the characteristics of the individual who's collecting it. I mean, it's almost like asking, can a white man play the blues? And the answer is yes. I mean, there are bad blues players who are white, but there are also some spectacular ones. So, I think we have to be very alert to what the procedures are that are used regardless of who is collecting the data.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, he's my colleague from the same department. So
I didn't really want to ask a second question, but just as a footnote to your question and your response, I know something about the U.S. Census, and traditionally the U.S. Census takers are recruited from as local a community as possible because of a presumption of trust.
Yeah.
But that's very specific to the U.S. And for example, in the U.K., surveys show that people would much rather be asked census questions by someone from the far end of the country, which kind of points a little bit to the cultural background to this issue of whether enumerators, whether it matters who they are.
Yeah.
Great. So is there a last question or comment? No? Then if not, we close at sharp. We really thank Professor Darity for this wonderful lecture, learning experience. Recommend looking up his work, his collaboration with Kirsten, many other interesting colleagues, often former students, which also really speaks for you that you're a mentor and have helped others with their careers as well. So please look up his body of work that has been emerging since 1975 at least. And thank you again, Sandy, for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you.